claiming its space. But even the wind sounded staged now, like a breath held too long. Shadow's tail went rigid, his body stiffened, shoulders locked in perfect stillness. Ethan followed his gaze. The car remained motionless, the world waiting. Then, with a slow, reluctant groan that cut through the silence like a confession, the driver's door creaked open on its own. No one abandons a car this deep into the forest unless they had a reason to disappear. The thought followed Ethan like an echo as he stood before the silver 2009 Chevrolet Malibu, its shape half swallowed by time and wild growth. The car sat, tilted in a cradle of roots, its once sleek body dulled by years of rain and dust, windows streaked with amber stains of age. It should have looked dead, but it didn't. There was something too deliberate about its placement, like it had been hidden, not lost. He took a slow breath and crouched beside the driver's door. The registration tag on the license plate had faded into near illegibility, but the number 21 was still visible, the year the world had felt off balance, the year he'd tried to rebuild his mind in this very county. 2 years. 2 years since someone had driven this car down a path no GPS could name and left it for the forest to claim. The windshield bore a fracture that looked like a lightning scar across its surface, spidering into thin white veins. Pollen covered the dashboard, a fine yellow film that whispered of long neglect. Through the dusty window, a small toy truck lay lodged beneath the passenger seat, bright blue plastic turned pale by the sun. Shadow circled the car, nose pressed low to the ground, tail flicking once for every new scent. Ethan followed, scanning the forest floor the way a soldier scans a street before crossing. Mud clung to the tires, still soft at the edges, suggesting movement more recent than the decay implied. His eyes found faint tire impressions leading off the narrow dirt trail before dissolving into moss. He knelt and traced the outline of a boot print adult size, heavy sole, worn tread. Whoever had been here didn't walk lightly. A familiar tension coiled inside him, the pulse of duty, that invisible tether to a life he had tried to outgrow but couldn't sever. It was the old rhythm of responsibility, the habit of stepping toward danger instead of away from it. He hadn't felt that in years, not since he turned in his service pistol and tried to trade uniform for anonymity. But now, the forest had shifted back into command mode, his surroundings, once again, a grid of strategy and threat. Shadow stopped by the rear passenger door, nostrils flaring. His body stilled, head tilting slightly as he inhaled. Ethan opened the door slowly, the hinge groaning in protest. The air that escaped was cold, even in the weak November warmth. Inside, the smell was a mixture of damp fabric, gasoline, and something faintly organic like earth disturbed too recently. The upholstery was mottled with discoloration, but one mark on the back seat drew his focus. It was dark, small, and circular, embedded deep into the cloth, a brown stain that looked older than the rest. Ethan stared at it without moving. He didn't need to name it to know what it resembled. His body remembered what his mind didn't want to. He straightened and scanned the clearing. There were no fresh disturbances, no signs of a struggle, but the air was too still, too composed. His training whispered through the quiet, secure, scan, report. But there was no radio to call in, no platoon to cover him, no command waiting for his coordinates. There was only the forest, vast and unconcerned, and the sense that whatever had happened here wasn't finished. He stepped around the car again and froze when he noticed the sticker on the bumper. Its edges had curled from rain and time, but the message was still clear: equality for all. The words were sun-bleached and cracked, yet stubbornly present. Ethan's mind flickered to memories of protests he had seen back home, marches filled with people shouting for justice, while others stood in opposition, waving different flags. He remembered how divided the small Georgia town had felt, how easily decency had fractured into hate. He'd left to fight another country's war, only to realize the deeper one waited for him here. Shadow let out a low whine, drawing him back. The dog had shifted his focus toward the trunk, tail straight as a rod, body quivering with a tension that Ethan could feel through the air. The veteran stepped closer, fingertips brushing. The cold metal edge, the surface bore scratches thin, jagged lines that ran across the paint in erratic directions. He followed them with his eyes until they converged near the keyhole, like something or someone had clawed at it. He stood completely still. The forest, moments ago indifferent, seemed to lean closer now, its silence deepening into intent. The sound of his own breathing felt misplaced, too loud. He looked around once more, no movement, no sound, only the shifting of distant branches. The dog's ears flattened. The moment stretched thin, like film burning under heat. Ethan's thoughts scattered through every possibility. A hit and run? A dumped vehicle from some forgotten crime? Or something quieter? Something rooted in the racial tensions he'd seen simmer across this part of the South for years? The sticker, the stain, the silence, it all hinted at something buried, not just physically, but morally. Someone had wanted this car to vanish. He reached for the trunk handle out of reflex, but the motion died midway. The metal was cold enough to sting. He stared at his reflection in the chrome, faint and fractured by dirt. His heart began to hammer, not from fear but from recognition. He'd seen this type of scene before, overseas, something left behind, waiting for someone foolish or curious enough to investigate. His instinct told him to walk away. His conscience wouldn't let him. He exhaled and stepped back. Shadow stayed fixed on the trunk, every muscle trembling with the effort of restraint. Ethan swallowed hard and looked once more toward the canopy, where sunlight strained to reach the ground. The forest was still, too still. Then, in that fragile quiet, the metallic sound came again, a slow, heavy click, deliberate and undeniable. The trunk latch moved by itself, releasing with a low sigh that cut through the silence. The lid began to lift, inch by inch, as though something on the other side had been waiting for permission to breathe. The smell hit him before the truth did rot, gasoline, and the faint perfume of fear. It was a scent that belonged to no single moment, yet carried the weight of 100 memories he had tried to bury beneath quiet mornings and long walks. Ethan stood still for a long time, his breath shallow, the forest bending around him as though it wanted no part of what came next. The trunk stood open now, gaping like a mouth that had waited too long to speak. The air inside was thick, unmoving, the kind of air that had learned to keep secrets. He braced himself and lifted the lid higher, letting the dim light spill across the interior. There was no body, but the absence was worse than a presence. Torn seatbelt straps dangled from the hinge, strands of duct tape clung to the carpet lining, and streaks of something long dried spread like old wounds across the fabric. It was not just decay he smelled. It was the echo of something human that had been here, terrified and desperate. The forest had tried to reclaim the evidence, but it couldn't erase the intent that had been left behind. A plastic grocery bag lay crumpled in one corner, its contents spilled as if someone had searched it in haste. Ethan crouched, his knees sinking into the damp ground, and pulled the torn bag toward him. Inside, a few scraps of paper had fused together from moisture, and among them, a single photograph. It was split diagonally, edges stiff and warped, the image inside half erased by time. Still, the faces were clear enough to sting. A black child, maybe 8 or 9 years old, smiling shyly at the camera. Beside him, an older white man rested a hand on the boy's shoulder. Their smiles didn't match. The child's eyes looked at something beyond the frame, and the man's expression was the practiced politeness of someone who had learned how to pretend at kindness. Ethan turned the photo over, but the back was blank. A memory surfaced: uninvited news reports before his deployment. The marches in Georgia where voices rose for equality while others answered with venom. He remembered standing outside a gas station once, watching a group of men draped in flags that had nothing to do with freedom, shouting slurs at strangers. Hatred had a way of dressing itself as patriotism, and he had seen that disguise too many times. He had gone to war for ideals that fractured easily under the weight of human contradiction, and somehow this photograph felt like a continuation of that same lie. The forest seemed to lean closer, its silence shifting again from patience to pressure. He placed the photograph carefully on the trunk lip, as though returning something sacred to where it was found. His heart thudded slow but hard. The photo felt recent, not relic, a crime scene in progress, not a ghost from history. Someone had wanted to erase that connection between the man and the boy, but hadn't managed to finish the job. Shadow began pacing in a slow, deliberate circle, nose close to the ground. His movements were sharp, methodical, tracing invisible pathways that only scent could reveal. The dog barked once, low and clipped, toward the deeper stretch of trees. The sound cut through the air like a command. Ethan's gaze followed the line of the dog's body to where the forest thickened. The fog caught between trunks, like smoke that couldn't find the wind. He rose and stepped around the trunk, scanning the soil. The earth here was soft, spongy with moisture. But near the car's rear tire, something interrupted the texture, a single footprint pressed into the mud. It was small, too small for an adult. The tread was faint, the heel shallow, the impression narrowing at the toe. A child's footprint, fresh enough that water hadn't yet filled it. Ethan crouched again, tracing its edge with a gloved finger, feeling the soft crumble of disturbed soil. He didn't need to think. The old instincts did that for him. Someone had been here, watching or escaping, maybe both. His mind began to build the scenario, an adult and a child. Something gone wrong. Fear driving the decision to flee. The duct tape, the photo, the car's hiding place. It all pointed to something human and cruel, something that didn't need a battlefield to wound. He stood and looked deeper into the trees. The forest had swallowed all sound again, as though it disapproved of what he was about to do. But his conscience left him no choice. He called softly for Shadow, and the dog returned to his side, alert, ears high. Together, they stepped past the car, leaving the evidence of pain behind and following the faint trail of what remained. The fog thickened as they moved. Every step felt like crossing a boundary between the known and the forbidden. The light faded faster than it should have, clouds rolling low enough to press against the treetops. The forest floor was uneven, littered with branches that crackled underfoot despite his efforts at silence. Still, the trail was there, small footprints, some deeper, some skipping, as if whoever made them had stumbled, then regained balance. The pattern was erratic, but purposeful. He stopped once, crouching beside a patch of leaves that had been brushed aside. A small scrap of fabric lay there, gray and torn, caught on a bramble. It was soft between his fingers, a fragment of clothing. He tucked it into his jacket pocket without thinking. The air was cooler now, the scent of gasoline fading but replaced by something sharper. Fear itself had a smell. He was convinced of that. It lingered on fabric, on breath, on the spaces where silence grew too loud. Shadow lifted his head suddenly, ears twitching. His body angled slightly to the left, muscles tightening as if tuned to a frequency Ethan couldn't hear. The veteran stilled, every sense stretched thin. There it was, a sound faint and distant, fragile enough to be mistaken for imagination, but it was real. Through the fog ahead came the soft, trembling sound of a child's whimper. The whimper wasn't fear, it was the sound of someone who had already seen too much. Ethan froze in place, the forest holding its breath with him. The sound came again, softer this time, followed by the fragile snap of a twig somewhere just beyond the fog's thin veil. He motioned for Shadow to stay and moved forward, his boots pressing carefully into the damp ground. The world seemed to narrow to the space between heartbeats. The mist parted slightly as he stepped around a fallen oak, its trunk blanketed in moss, and there he saw him, a small boy, no older than 9, standing barefoot in the hollow beneath the tree. The child's skin was dark, his face smudged with dirt, his eyes too wide for his age. His hair was matted, his clothes torn and damp from the cold ground. He didn't cry, didn't run. He just stared, silent, as if waiting to see whether Ethan was another danger or a miracle. Ethan's breath caught in his chest, and for a long moment, neither moved. Then, Shadow broke the stillness. The Labrador lowered his head and took a slow step forward, tail wagging in cautious rhythm. The boy flinched at first but didn't retreat. The dog stopped within arm's reach, letting out a low, friendly whine that seemed to coax a hint of calm back into the air. Ethan knelt slowly, careful not to startle him. His voice stayed silent. Words felt too fragile for this kind of encounter. The boy's eyes shifted from Shadow to Ethan, and then to the trees behind him, as though checking for what might follow. There was a deep exhaustion in that look, the kind that belonged to someone who had been running too long from something they couldn't name. Without speaking, the child raised one shaking hand and pointed back in the direction of the car. Ethan followed the gesture, his pulse tightening. The implication was clear. Whatever horror had begun there had pushed this child out here into the cold. He turned back, noticing the boy's hands now trembling at his sides. Bruises marked both wrists, faint and discolored, the unmistakable pattern of restraint. It was a detail that hit harder than any explosion ever could. He felt that familiar ache of helplessness, the one he thought he'd buried overseas when he left behind the people he couldn't save. He tried to steady his breathing as he scanned the area. The ground around them bore no fresh footprints other than the boys, but something about the stillness made it clear that they weren't alone. He needed information, something tangible. Moving slowly, he motioned to the boy's torn shirt pocket, asking silently with a nod if he could look. The child hesitated, then gave the faintest nod. Ethan reached in gently and pulled out a small, crumpled piece of paper. The edges were soft, the ink smudged, but the words were still legible. "If you find him, don't tell them. They'll never let him live free." The sentence landed in him like shrapnel. He read it twice, then folded it carefully, and slipped it into his own jacket. It was more than a note, it was a confession, a warning, maybe even a plea. His thoughts drifted backward to faces he'd seen in another life, soldiers who had followed orders they didn't believe in, people punished for the color of their skin, families torn apart because silence was easier than confrontation. He had told himself that those days were behind him, but standing here, in this forest that seemed to breathe secrets, he realized history never really stopped. It just changed uniforms. The boy shivered violently, his lips pale. Ethan removed his jacket and wrapped it around the small shoulders, feeling the bone and fear beneath the skin. Shadow pressed against the boy's side, warmth and loyalty in motion. It was enough to draw a flicker of something like trust into the child's eyes, though his gaze kept darting toward the shadows beyond the clearing. Ethan followed it instinctively. At first, there was nothing, only the whisper of whine through high branches. Then came the faint glimmer of light, distant but moving, flickering erratically between the trees. Headlights, 2, maybe 3, cutting through the fog like knives through gauze. The boy's breath hitched sharply, his hands clenching at the edge of the jacket. The light wavered closer, bouncing over the uneven terrain, and with it came the distant hum of an engine winding down. Someone was coming, and they weren't lost. Ethan's mind snapped into clarity. He scanned the area, no good hiding spots, too many open angles, but the thick brush behind them offered a narrow path leading deeper into the woods. He stood quickly, guiding the boy to his feet. The child stumbled once, knees weak, but Ethan caught him by the shoulder, steadying him with a quiet assurance that came more from instinct than thought. Shadow stayed close, eyes fixed on the advancing glow. The engine shut off. Silence returned, heavier now, threaded with menace. Then came the sound of car doors opening, one after another. Muffled voices carried through the trees, low and sharp. The words weren't clear, but the tone was unmistakable impatience and command. Whoever they were searching for something. Or someone. Ethan's mind raced. He didn't know who they were, but the note in his pocket made one thing certain: they weren't the kind of people who came to help. He crouched low, pulling the boy gently beside him, signaling for quiet. Shadow mirrored the motion automatically, sinking close to the ground. The headlights swung wider now, cutting across the path where they had been standing moments ago. The forest was no longer safe. It had become a stage lit by suspicion. He felt the boy trembling beside him, a heartbeat fluttering against his sleeve. Ethan placed a hand over the child's, not to silence him, but to steady him. Loyalty wasn't something learned. It was something remembered, and in that moment, he remembered every reason he had once risked his life for strangers. This was no different. The voices drew closer. He could make out footsteps now, 2 sets, deliberate, cautious, experienced. The forest that had once felt endless suddenly felt too small. Ethan leaned down, whispered the only thing that mattered in a tone the boy could feel rather than hear. "Run when I do." The fog thickened, headlights cutting and fading in erratic pulses. The world shrank to breath, heartbeat, anticipation. Then, without another sound, Ethan grabbed the boy's hand and pulled him into the brush, just as 2 long shadows stepped into the clearing, their silhouettes framed by the trembling light. Evil doesn't always wear uniforms. Sometimes it wears old American flags on leather jackets. The sound of car doors slamming shattered the fragile silence that had held the forest together. Ethan crouched lower into the brush, feeling the damp soil press cold against his knees. The boy was beside him, small and trembling, clutching Shadow's fur as if it were the last real thing left in the world. The dog's breathing was low and steady, every instinct sharpened. Ethan rested one steadying hand on the child's shoulder and peered through the veil of branches. A black SUV sat crooked on the forest road, its engine ticking as it cooled. Two men climbed out, their flashlights cutting uneven circles through the mist. Their movements were casual, careless even, but Ethan recognized the rhythm of people who felt invincible. Both were white, rough-faced, wearing leather jackets patched with torn flags and slogans that pretended to mean pride but reeked of hate. The taller one held his flashlight like a weapon, swinging it back and forth through the dark. The heavy-set man followed a few steps behind, his posture slouched, but dangerous in its confidence. Their voices were loud enough to echo. "The boss said nobody'd find it out here," the heavier one grumbled, kicking a rock that bounced against the Malibus. "Tire. Guess the forest ain't as empty as we thought." His accent was southern, thick, gritty, the kind that carried centuries of inherited bitterness. "Shut up," the tall one hissed. "Just check the car. If he's gone, we've got a bigger problem." He turned in a slow half-circle, the beam of his light slicing through the fog. Ethan ducked instinctively, the motion practiced, almost invisible. The boy pressed closer, and Shadow stayed absolutely still, muscles tight beneath his coat. Ethan studied the men the way he'd been trained to study targets, not for violence, but for patterns. The tall one led with authority. The heavier one followed orders, but liked the sound of his own voice. They weren't strangers to the woods or to cruelty. Their tone wasn't panic. It was irritation, the sound of men cleaning up a mess they believed belonged to them. "Maybe the kid wandered off," the tall one muttered, pulling open the driver's door of the abandoned car. The hinges groaned, the flashlight beam darting over the empty seat and the scattered debris. "No way he gets far barefoot in this cold." "He better not," the heavier man replied, spitting into the dirt. "Ain't worth all this trouble for one kid anyway. Should have finished it when we had the chance." The words hit Ethan like cold water. He felt a tightening in his chest, a slow burn of rage, the same kind that had once made him act without thinking, without knowing who he was saving or why. But he wasn't a soldier anymore. There were no orders to follow, no backup to call. There was only a boy who had trusted him without words, and a forest that seemed to close tighter with every passing second. He watched as the taller man circled to the trunk. The beam of his flashlight swept across the same evidence Ethan had found: the torn seatbelt, the duct tape residue, the photograph that still lay where Ethan had set it. The man paused, the light trembling slightly. "Someone's been here," he said, voice low but certain. "The bag's open." The heavier man laughed, a sound without humor. Then they saw it. "Don't matter. This place'll eat whatever's left. Always does." Ethan's stomach turned. There was no remorse in their tone, only irritation that their secret had been disturbed. He could feel the weight of choice pressing down on him, the temptation to step out, to confront, to end it. But he couldn't risk the boy. Loyalty meant patience, not impulse. He forced his breathing into silence. Shadow's ears twitched, catching something first, a shift in their direction. The tall one's flashlight now sweeping toward the brush where they hid. The dog's growl rose in his throat, low and controlled, vibrating against Ethan's arm. The sound was barely audible, but enough. The taller man stopped mid-step. "You hear that?" he said, turning sharply. The beam of his flashlight held steady now, focused toward the trees. The heavy-set man froze, his hand hovering near his jacket pocket. "Probably an animal," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Coyote, maybe?" "Coyotes don't breathe like that," the tall one replied, taking 2 slow steps forward. Sounded closer. He adjusted his light and scanned the undergrowth in deliberate sweeps. Ethan's pulse drummed in his ears. The boy's hand clutched his arm, small fingers cold and shaking. He wanted to whisper reassurance, but even a breath too loud would betray them. He looked down at Shadow, who was coiled and still, the whites of his eyes barely visible in the dark. The bond between man and dog was wordless, an old language of trust and timing. Shadow's tail didn't move, his breathing slowed to match Ethan's. The men stopped near the car. The heavier one sighed, impatience leaking through his fear. "We find him, we finish it, and we leave. I ain't staying out here all night." The taller one didn't respond. Immediately, his gaze lingered on the trees. The mist swirled around his legs like smoke, and for a heartbeat, the forest seemed to hold him in its grip. Then he raised his flashlight higher, tilting it toward the deeper shadows. The beam swung in a wide arc and landed directly on the patch of brush where Ethan knelt. The light sliced through branches and leaves, spilling across the ground. It stopped, unmoving, as if it had found something worth studying. Ethan's breath caught. The boy buried his face into Shadow's fur. For a moment, everything stilled the air. The insects, even the trembling of the earth under their knees. The taller man squinted, leaning forward. "Hold up," he murmured. "What's that?" Ethan's heart stuttered once. The flashlight beam settled, unwavering, on the edge of his boot, mud-caked, motionless, but unmistakably human. Sometimes the monsters you meet in the woods are the same ones you served beside. The realization didn't arrive as a thought but as a cold slide along Ethan's spine, the body remembering before the mind dared to name it. The flashlight's beam had already found his boots. Instinct did the rest. He moved without noise, gathering the boy close, hand steady at a small shoulder, guiding him through a seam in the brush where the earth dipped and the ferns rose like a green curtain. Shadow pivoted on cue, loosing a sharp volley of barks that ricocheted through the trees, then darting sideways to stir sound where there was no body. Confusion bloomed behind them, commands tangled with curses. The forest answered with the dry percussion of branches knocked by careless feet and the hollow thud of a flashlight smacking bark. Ethan kept them low and moving, choosing ground that swallowed footsteps, weaving the boy through corridors of saplings where adult frames would snag. The air cooled as they slipped farther from the road, the fog laying a damp hand across hair and skin. Every detail arranged itself into a map, the tilt of a fallen log, the scalloped edge of a stump gnawed by beetles, the faint sheen of water pooled in a hoofprint. He read it all and chose the path that wrote silence instead of speed. Shadow rejoined them, breath quick but controlled, eyes shining with the bright intelligence of a creature bred for trust. Behind them, the men spread out, their light strobed through the understory in frantic arcs, their words resolving into shapes Ethan knew too well, certainty disguised as command, anger used as compass. The forest wasn't wide enough to erase them. It could only distort them, break their lines, test their patience. He guided the boy to a shallow depression bordered by palmetto and knuckled roots, then flattened beside him, counting heartbeats until their breathing matched the tempo of wind. The dog slid into the hollow, becoming a dark comma between them. Movement flashed to their right, one of the men pushing through a screen of vine, breath ragged with irritation. The beam of his flashlight skittered along trunks, jumped to the ground, then bounced to his own forearm as he wiped sweat with the back of his hand. The sleeve hitched, exposing ink. Ethan didn't need to see the whole design to know it. The angled lines, the daggered wings, the unit numbers nested in a shape only their platoon had worn. Recognition cut clean through him, flensing away whatever doubt remained. He watched the beam slide again across that familiar insignia, and felt time fold until sand and pine needles lay on the same floor. Not strangers, not chance, brothers once, at least in name. Men who had turned the anger that war planted into an ideology that promised belonging at someone else's expense. He remembered rumors after discharge, the way certain voices had grown louder around town, calling themselves protectors while they searched for enemies where neighbors lived. He had stepped away then, telling himself that distance was refusal. He had believed silence could be integrity. Now, faced with the shape that silence had allowed, he saw it for what it had been, a permission he had never intended to give. The forest mirrored his inventory of failures. Every tree seemed to hold a moment he hadn't contradicted, every root a word he should have spoken. Somewhere, a barred owl cast its question into the dark and got no answer. Ethan studied the ground for options that didn't taste like the past. No confrontation, no force, just motion and witness. The clean work of getting a child out of harm's geography. He traced a route in his head that would skirt the ridge, thread a dry creek, and spit them out near the old Ranger Road. It would be slow, it would be quiet. It would depend on timing and the men's impatience. He shifted, signaling with a fingertip, wait, breathe, later. The boy's eyes clung to him the way a swimmer clings to the last warm edge of shore. Shadow rested his chin on the boy's knee. The contact small but anchoring. A gust unstitched the fog, and in the brief clarity, Ethan saw the taller man halt, head tipped, body arranged in the listening posture of a hunter who has finally remembered to stop talking. The beam steadied. Leaves held still. The night narrowed to an ear. They had not yet been seen, but the lattice of cover had thinned. He measured distance to the next fold in terrain, weighed the sound his weight would make against wet leaf and hollow log, calculated the rhythm of the men's sweeps 3 counts across, 2 down, 1 idle drift. He waited for the drift. When it came, he slid forward with the boy a measured span, then another, then stilled. The men resumed their crosshatch of light and grievance, circling the absence where their certainty should have been. Ethan's chest ached with the slow burn of withheld breath. Beneath the ache, another heat kept rising, the rage reserved for betrayals too intimate to categorize. It wasn't the rage that made a body swing. It was the moral fever that floods a person who sees their old choices walking toward them, wearing new harm. He realized the boy was shaking less now, the tremor smoothing to a shiver that had more to do with cold than terror. The small shoulder pressed against his arm, and that simple weight rewrote priority. Loyalty decided for him what fear could not. The narrative was plain as the footprints they followed earlier. The boy had witnessed something he was never meant to name. The car had been a container, the trunk a plan, the forest the wrong accomplice. These men had turned their training into a ritual of control, their symbols into permission slips. Ethan had once signed his name beside theirs. That knowledge scalded and clarified. The only answer left was refusal, not as noise, but as method. He built the next minutes in his head like a quiet blueprint. Send shadow to stir sound along the creek bed. Draw the lights that way. Shift with the boy across the saddle of the ridge. Use the palmetto screen to mask their silhouette. Let distance do the work pride always ruins. No heroics, no force, only the stubborn geometry of escape. Resolve settled inside him, with the finality of a seal pressed into cooling wax. Not this time, not by omission, not by comfort, not by the old lie that staying out of it keeps one's hands clean. He steadied his palm on the boy's back, readying the first inch of movement, when the night cracked with a metallic syllable that required no translation. Somewhere behind them, precise and patient, a rifle was brought to readiness. Sometimes redemption isn't earned in sunlight, it's fought for in the dark. The forest became a living instrument beneath Ethan's hands, each root and hollow a note he could press without sound. He felt the terrain as if it were muscle memory rises to break sightlines, depressions to swallow silhouettes, wet leaves that demanded a softer gait. Behind him, the boy moved in small, careful steps, guided by the same steady palm that had ushered him out of the clearing. Shadow held close, breath quiet, attention angled toward every rustle the wind didn't claim. Ethan's heart worked in measured strokes, converting fear into function. He studied the grid of trees and built a path that did more than hide, it misled. Where the ground ran soft, he angled prints toward a thicket, then cut back uphill along a seam of rock that left almost no trace. He watched for branches that would snap under careless weight and tested them with the lightest pressure before shifting them to places. He wanted footsteps to happen. The night cooled around them, fog loosening into thin ropes that trailed through the understory. Each breath tasted of pine and iron, reminders of work still to do. Distractions came first. He lifted a dry stick and tucked it beneath a sagging limb so that a brush of air would crack it in the wrong direction. He palmed 2 small stones and sent them skipping into a creek bed with a flick that landed noise among water-slick pebbles. Where the path narrowed, he brushed his sleeve against bark to leave scent where he wanted attention, then crossed downwind to erase the truth. The forest began to echo with ordinary accidents, the kind that lure impatience into making choices. The men obliged, their lights splitting apart, curses carrying like flares. The heavier one lumbered toward the sound along the creek. Confidence turned clumsy under pressure. Ethan waited for the pause between his footfalls and guided the boy forward, using a line of blueberry shrubs to mask the swing of their knees. Shadow darted out on cue, rattling cattails in the marshy edge and then slipping back to heel, the movement quick enough to plant doubt and gone fast enough to deny certainty. The pattern worked. The men separated further, one set of steps climbing, one stumbling down. At the ravine's lip, Leaves had formed a false floor over loam, slick with runoff. Ethan placed the boy behind a slab of root-tangled earth and signaled stillness. He slid along the contour until he stood above the heavier man, who had committed to the wrong trail with the right amount of arrogance. The ground did the rest. A shift of weight, a low crumble, a surprised grunt. The man slid into the leaf-choked pocket, winded rather than wounded, his flashlight caroming off stone to vanish under fern. Ethan was already moving, a shadow among shadows, arriving with the quiet authority of someone who refuses escalation. There was no struggle to win, there was only a situation to neutralize. He recovered the flashlight and placed it face down to keep the beam contained. From his pocket came the lengths of repurposed strap he had coiled earlier from the car's torn seatbelt. He used them without force, working quickly while the man gasped against the slope, palms guided behind in motions that felt procedural rather than punitive. The restraint held. The leaf cradled more dignity than the man had offered others. Ethan checked for breath, for clarity, for the line between humiliation and harm, and left him intact on the safe side of that line. The phone came next, lodged in a jacket pocket that yielded to a patient hand. Its screen woke to a chaos of messages and images that did not surprise him, only confirmed a sickness he already understood. Threads of coordination, photos taken like trophies, a calendar seeded with rallies disguised as heritage, names he recognized from barroom whispers and county gossip. The truth was larger than the woods it had, bureaucracies and bank accounts, symbols stitched to claim virtue while distributing contempt. He locked the device, pocketed it, and photographed the ravine's landmarks with his memory, in case a map later needed testimony. He guided the man up the easiest line of the slope until he was flat and breathing evenly, then slid the light a yard away where it could be found by its owner and not by accident. Mercy, he understood, wasn't indulgence. It was control of the story. He marked the place with a mental pin and moved on, the boy's small hand finding his sleeve by instinct. Shadow brushed the child's shin with a reassuring nudge and returned to point, ears pricked to the cadence of the remaining searcher. Flashbacks tried to intrude green screens of night vision, rooms cleared under orders he'd learned to resent, his own voice once sharpened by command. He let the memories pass without permission to anchor. This was not a raid, not a performance of strength. This was a narrow corridor to a precise outcome, and his role was simply to keep the corridor intact. The boy watched him with a gaze that mixed fear and belief into something like fragile trust, and Ethan felt purpose settle where anxiety had lived for too many years. The other man was methodical, the way only a former sergeant could be when pride is on the line. His light tracked deliberate arcs, his steps paused to listen, his judgment didn't yield to irritation. Ethan recognized the pattern and built his countermeasure from respect rather than contempt. He skirted the ridge to steal altitude, set a single clatter of rock where the slope magnified sound, and moved the boy through a ferned saddle that locked them out of the beam's typical sweep. Each placement was a negotiation with time, wait for the breath, shift with the wind, freeze when the leaves decide to hush. They reached a stand of young pines where needles carpeted the ground in the kind of quiet that protected movement. The Ranger Road lay another 100 yards downslope, invisible but present in the more open spacing of trunks and the pale seam of sky it drew. Ethan imagined the route as a single, continuous line, no heroics, no confrontation, just distance becoming safety, while a device in his pocket matured into leverage he would hand to people who still knew how to use the law. The boy steadied beside him, shadow pressing flank to calf, as if stitching courage directly into muscle. For a moment the forest felt almost merciful, the night loosening its grip enough to allow the future to walk forward. Then a hard sound split the air, clean, metallic, final. A shot, not aimed at flesh but loud enough to strike bone with its echo. Shadow flinched and yelped, not from pain but from shock, the sound bright and small against the immensity of the trees, and the echo carried the certainty that the past had closed the distance. The forest keeps every secret, but it never forgives the guilty. The shot still trembled in the air like a wire pulled too tight when Ethan moved, not with panic, but with the unbroken discipline of a man who measured distance in heartbeats. The sound had cracked the night open, and from that fracture rose a single, necessary direction. He cut across the slope where the ground held old water and recent leaves, guiding the boy with a firm hand, while Shadow's startled yelp faded into a thin, pained hush. The earth seemed to tilt toward the source, every root pointing the way, every fern bending, as if to clear a path for consequence. He found them by the ravine's lip where the fog pooled in quiet. The dog crouched low and trembling, not broken but shaken, a bright shock riding his breath. 10 paces away, the former sergeant stood in the steadied posture of a man who believed the dark belonged to him. The weapon hung in his hands like a claim, the barrel tilted in a line that hoped to become a verdict. The boy froze, then folded against a cedar trunk, his small frame absorbing the bark's cold until he nearly disappeared into it. Shadow raised his head, searching Ethan's face, as if for a command he already knew by heart. What followed held the stillness of rooms where decisions have already been made. No threats were traded, no names resurrected from the dust. The silence itself did the talking. The sergeant's expression carried an old certainty, the kind that mistook lineage for permission. It was a look Ethan recognized from parades and parking lots, from arguments that called themselves tradition. The accusation in that gaze did not need sound. Traitor to blood, to bond, to a fiction they had been handed and told to honor. Ethan did not move toward the weapon. He moved toward the boy, placing himself as hinge, as shield, as the single point upon which the forest's narrative could turn without shattering. The clarity in him was spare and absolute. He was not here to win, not here to punish, not here to prove a theory about good men in bad times. He was here to end a line of harm and to start another line that led away from it. His voice, when it finally threaded the cold, was nearly inaudible, a private inventory spoken for his own keeping. Choices, he reminded himself. One choice carried like weight for years. Another choice, if clean, could carry like light. The standoff was a geography more than a moment. Two figures balanced on the edge of a country they had both helped to construct without knowing where it ended. The forest recorded the scene with its usual precision. The pale seam of dawn preparing behind the pines, the faint rush of the creek below, the startled scrape of a squirrel high in a dead oak, the softer sound of a child steadying his own breath by counting the time between the dogs. Ethan shifted a half step, not to advance, but to square his frame between past and future. Shadow's ears tipped. The sergeant's knuckles whitened. The world refused to blink. When movement came, it was the quiet kind factors colliding, not tempers. The slope conceded a handful of soil. A boot found no friction. A hand reached out, not to strike, but to steady. The weapon dipped, then swung off its argument as weight redistributed across treacherous ground. There was a low, compressed sound, like breath exiting a stone. The dog scrambled backward. The boy's fingers curled in the cedar's bark. Ethan's shoulder twisted as he anchored himself to what remained solid. Then the ravine accepted what pride would not, and the night closed over the sudden geometry of bodies and gravity with a hush that did not feel like peace. After, nothing demanded spectacle. The sergeant lay where the earth had chosen to stop him, his certainty suddenly a private thing, the weapon cooling beside him like a discarded emblem. Ethan did not approach. He knelt with the boy and the dog in the thinnest light, one hand on fur, the other steady against a small back. He checked Shadow with the calm of ritual no tearing, only a welt where sound had struck harder than metal, a shock that would fade beneath the heat of loyalty. He pressed the dog gently to the ground until the trembling eased and the eyes lost their glassy question. The hours that followed unfolded with the morality of weather, inevitable, indifferent, clarifying. Dawn arrived in a blue that softened the edges of everything it touched. The forest gave back a road where none had been visible, a pale ribbon through loblolly and gum. Ethan guided boy and dog toward that seam, keeping to cover where habit insisted and to open ground where honesty did. The phone writing in his pocket had already become a map with names and dates, a ledger of intent people like to deny in daylight. Each step toward the road felt less like escape and more like record-keeping. The boy walked with a new steadiness, the jacket swallowing his narrow shoulders, the dog brushing his leg with a reliability that made language unnecessary. Ethan placed them at the road's mouth and composed the remainder of his obligations in an order that finally made sense. Deliver the living to where the law could reach them. Deliver the evidence to where the truth could survive. Deliver himself to the forest's ledger, which kept accounts longer than people did. He touched the boy's shoulder once, a small vow pressed into fabric and skin, then turned back the way they had come, following his own prints into the quiet they had disturbed. By mid-morning, rangers and deputies had the scene, their radios stitching the woods with a bureaucratic hum that sounded, for once, like order instead of noise. They found Ethan near the ravine's shoulder, body arranged by gravity and resolve, face softened into an expression that looked suspiciously like relief. The weapon lay where the knight had placed it. The phone gave up its archive, with the passcode a man uses when he finally wants to be known. What leaked next belonged to headlines and hearings. A coordinated ring draped in borrowed patriotism, a string of assaults and threats and photographs taken like trophies, a network that had believed itself invisible because it mostly moved in daylight wearing smiles. Cameras called it a veteran's tragedy, a county scandal, a national conversation. None of those phrases reached the private perimeter where a child slept for the first time without counting windows and where a black dog lay with his head on a small pair of shoes, guarding not out of fear, but out of ordinary love. The story the forest preferred was simpler. A man had stepped into the space between harm and its intention, not to become a myth, but to balance a scale he had once watched tilt the wrong way. Racism did not end that morning. Slogans did not dissolve. Flags did not forget how to lie. But one long silence did. The forest never spoke again, but the world finally listened. If this story moved something inside you, if it made you feel that silence can be as dangerous as hate, then don't let Ethan's sacrifice fade away. Share his story, keep the message alive, and subscribe for more truths the world tries to bury. Before you leave, tell me one thing in the comments. If you were in Ethan's place that night, would you have stayed silent or stepped into the dark too?